My name is Frank Mazzella. I'm the Learning Products Manager for Vision Research. I'm here to present a series of PCC, Phantom Camera Control software tutorials intended to show you many of the various features and processes incorporated in PCC. In this tutorial, Auto Exposure in PCC, you will learn how to use the Auto Exposure feature used to adjust the overall exposure of an image based on the light level. This is beneficial when the overall lighting changes dramatically during a recording. As the light changes, the camera automatically adjusts the exposure time to maintain a constant image exposure. Auto exposure is most useful in constantly changing light conditions. For example, exposures can vary between 2 or 3 f-stops when clouds roll in overhead. To use this feature effectively, it should be set using the longest acceptable exposure time with the lens stop down. Once enabled, open the lens iris to the widest aperture. The camera will automatically increase the shutter speed to compensate for the additional light. When set in this manner, the user allows either a brighter or darkening of the overall light level, while maintaining a steady exposure. Before we start, it's important to note that the auto exposure feature cannot be used in conjunction with the EDR or Extreme Dynamic Range feature. Once the auto exposure feature is enabled, EDR will automatically be disabled, and auto exposure should not be enabled while performing a CSR or a current session reference. There are slight differences in the way the feature works based on the generation of the Phantom camera. First, let's talk about how auto exposure works in Phantom V and Miro series cameras released prior to 2012, referred to as PH7 cameras. With these camera models, an auto exposure area and threshold needs to be defined manually. This is done by setting a desired exposure level and drawing a rectangle on the live image in which to judge the light level for the exposure. For the first part of this tutorial, I'm going to use the Phantom V12 Cam 1 camera, tightly focused on the black and white scale that I will use to demonstrate the auto exposure adjustments by the camera. With the cine settings already set, I need to open the auto exposure selector to define the auto exposure parameters. In order to define these parameters, I need to enable or check the auto exposure feature. Then I'll need to specify a desired level, which is the average grayscale level for the specified area to be realized by the automatic exposure process. In all PH7 cameras, this is measured on a scale from 0 being black and 255 being saturated. Mid-gray is 128. The easiest way to determine this value is to disable or uncheck the auto exposure feature, then open the Image Tools dialog window. Just under the histogram, the software displays an average grayscale value for all the pixels of the image. This value is a good starting point. So, let's close the Image Tools dialog window, re-enable the auto exposure feature, and enter that value into the level data entry field. Now I could adjust that level by reducing its value, the number of grayscale levels I anticipate the area may change if the area gets brighter or overexposed, or increase the level, the number of grayscale values I anticipate the area may change if the area gets darker or underexposed. I'm going to leave it at the average value. Since I want the exposure time to change once the camera is triggered, I'm going to disable or uncheck the Lock at Trigger option. Now I need to define an area of interest rectangle, the area in the image I want the camera to base its auto exposure value on. I'll do this by drawing a box around an area in which the auto exposure calculations are to be based on. Once I release the mouse key, I'll need to select auto exposure from the pop-up selection window. Notice the rectangle parameters, the XY coordinates of the upper left and bottom right pixels of the area used to calculate the amount of exposure change are automatically populated. Alternatively, I could have entered those points manually. Or, if I wanted the entire image to be used to calculate the auto exposure values, I could click the full button. It's important to note that the larger the area is, the slower the adjustment process will become. The last thing I'm going to do is enable or check the Show on Image option. That places a rectangle, not recorded in the cine, over the live image indicating the auto exposure rectangle area. Now I'm going to open the aperture of the lens to the widest setting and set the exposure to the maximum exposure time. When I do, the camera will automatically increase the shutter speed to compensate for the additional light. Doing this allows the camera to maintain a steady exposure for either a brighter or darkening of the overall light level. As I move the camera slowly from side to side, the area rectangle is moving from light to dark, causing the camera to automatically adjust its shutter speed, or exposure, accordingly. At this point, I could, if I wanted to, capture, review, edit, and save a cine, just as we did in the Capturing Your First Cine and Editing and Saving Your First Cine tutorials. For this tutorial, I'm not going to record a cine. Before we finish this portion of the tutorial, I want to disable or uncheck the auto exposure feature. Now let's talk about how the auto exposure feature works with Phantom cameras released since late 2011, referred to as PH16 cameras. These camera models run on a new protocol which enables a different method of setting auto exposure. The control is much simpler with fewer variables. For this portion of the tutorial, I'm going to use the Miro 320S Cam 2 camera. With the cine settings already defined, just as I did for the earlier PH7 camera models, I need to open the auto exposure selector and define the auto exposure parameters. First, I'll enable or check the auto exposure feature. Now I'll need to select the mode, or the area the camera will use, to correct the exposure time by selecting it from the Mode pull-down selection list. Average instructs the camera to calculate exposure time based on the average exposure of the full image. Spot instructs the camera to calculate the exposure based on a small area in the center of the image. And Center Weighted averages a larger area in the center of the live image to use. I'm going to select Spot for this example. Then I'll specify the exposure compensation using the compensation slider. A compensation of 0 would be an average of 50% gray level. The compensation can then expand to plus or minus 2 f-stops. I can use the right and left arrow keys of the control computer to fine-tune the slider position. And just as I did before, I'm going to open the aperture of the lens to the widest setting and set the exposure to the maximum exposure time. When I do, the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to compensate for the lighting conditions. Doing this allows the camera to maintain a steady exposure for either a brighter or darkening of the overall light level. As I move the camera slowly from side to side, the area I selected is moving from light to dark, causing the camera to automatically adjust its shutter speed or exposure accordingly. At this point, I could, if I wanted to, capture, review, edit, and save a cine, just as we did in the Capturing Your First Cine and Reviewing Your First Cine and Editing and Saving Your First Cine tutorials. For this tutorial, I'm not going to record a cine. Before we finish this tutorial, I want to disable or uncheck the auto exposure feature. So that concludes the auto exposure in PCC tutorial, where we describe the various ways auto exposure needs to be set up depending on the type of camera being used. For in-depth Phantom operations, Vision Research offers Phantom Operations Certification Training. Please visit our training webpage at www.phantomhighspeed.com, Service Support, Training. Or contact your local sales representative, who can be found on our website under the Contact Us pull-down selection list for more information about our training sessions, or for Phantom cameras in general.